I'm Mason President Gregory Washington, welcoming you to the second episode of our Future Transformed, a series of conversations with Mason's leading experts about the grand challenges of today and tomorrow. My guest today is Dr. Fernando Miralles Wilhelm, Dean of Mason's College of Science, to talk about the water crisis and how we solve it. When we think about water as a grand challenge, the first question that actually comes to my mind is water the next oil?
I think it is, and it probably has been for a long time. And if you look at human history, people have been battling for water since the ages. If you think about your first history lesson, water was in it. You know, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. It's been happening for a long time, and it's happening now, and it will continue happening in the future.
You know, when we talk about water and we start to think about it as a grand challenge, it starts from the premise that there's plenty of it. It's just not always in the places it needs to be and the time that it needs to be there. Can you highlight some of the major challenges associated with water that you think need our attention?
Of course, and I think you're right, quite right in the issue of water not being in the right place at the right time. And so the majority of problems that we have with water around the world, and certainly in the U.S., it's really about having too much water, having too little water, not having enough water when you need it, or having too much of it when you don't. And that affects our lives in significant ways.
Mm-hmm. You know, I came here from California. And right before the pandemic. And while I was there, the crisis at that time was severe drought and too little water. If you fast forward 12 atmospheric rivers in that same area in Southern California, now the problem is actually too much water.
Exactly.
In just a short period of time. So this water can be a regional problem that changes with time.
Yes.
So in the DC region, where we are here today, there have been some notable examples of urban flooding. What is the driver? What's going on?
Well, I think one thing about water that's very easy to understand, but very difficult to predict, is that water moves. You know, you have water in the atmosphere, you have water in the oceans, you have water in rivers. It's moving all the time. It's moving at different rates. So what ends up happening in places that we've seen, and certainly in the National Capital Region, where urban flooding is becoming a bigger issue. We had huge floods in Southwest Virginia just a few months ago, around the major Washington, D.C. area. There's urban flooding all the time, is the fact that that water has become concentrated in places where we have just built too much infrastructure. When we build cities, when we build roads, what we're doing is that we're replacing natural systems that can regulate water flow, that can absorb it, that can prevent flooding from happening, to pavements and buildings that tend to concentrate water, and that's where we're having the problem.
Many of our students from Western states are dealing with extremes when it comes to water. How can we respond to them, and what are some of the things that you know of that's happening here to help people respond to those challenges?
Yeah, certainly. So you mentioned the example of California, where just not so long ago, I mean, even a year ago, we were talking about the longest and most severe drought in the state's history, and then a few months later, now we're talking about huge floods. I think the takeaway is that we need to build water management systems that are resilient, that are able to control the too much water when it occurs, and store water when we don't have it, so that this thing balances out a little bit. And this is something that it is a tremendous challenge, but it is the only solution forward.
Around the globe, there have been examples of devastating wildfires. Like we've seen examples of this in the Amazon. We saw a huge example not too long ago in Australia. We've seen it actually also in California. And then we see these massive examples of flooding. In Pakistan, not too long ago globally, and then also in a number of our Western states as well. What are the challenges to addressing these issues, and how might we overcome them?
Well, the wildfires typically originate when the soil gets too dry, and then vegetation becomes natural fuel for fires to propagate. That is what was happening in the Amazon. That's what was happening in Australia just a few years back, and certainly in California, that continues to be the case, right? A drought will very likely result in wildfires spreading quicker. The solution to that is to really build systems that can store water and regulate essentially the moisture content of the soil. Soil is the biggest regulator of water around the world. It is, you think about big rivers, big lakes containing vast amounts of water, but the largest amount of water worldwide is contained in soils. And soils are the big regulator, and natural systems are the big regulators of water. So trying to allow natural systems to store water in a way that they prevent these things from happening is going to be a big part of how we solve these issues.
Given that a sizable amount of the globe's population lives in either climates that have very little water or no water at all, do we have any great examples of water management, any great examples that we can point to and ask the question, how are some of these other countries responding to either flooding or lack of water? How are they responding to it in ways that actually can help us here in the U.S.?
Yes, I always point to the example of countries in the Middle East as the most water scarce, but also as countries that have learned to live with little water in a moderately successful way. So water conservation, building infrastructure that stores water, using natural systems. What's the term these days is nature-based solutions, is using nature to store water. Those are the ways that you can actually mitigate the big peaks towards floods, or mitigate the big valleys towards floods, towards droughts.
Is it fair to compare those entities to the U.S. and what we can do in the U.S.? Is it, in some sense, we're very, very different, right? Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and let me tell you where it is that we're most different. And it's not in the physical or biological comparisons, because every place around the world gets some rain, it has some soil, has some vegetation, so those pieces tend to be more or less similar, even though they're somewhat different. The biggest difference between the U.S. and other countries is how we manage water. So let's take the example of the Western states, because in the U.S. we speak a lot about water rights. There's big water legislation that apportions water in a way that does not take into consideration the physical variable. So there are commitments for water to be delivered in places where you just don't have enough water. It's like I've committed to pay you a salary of water where I'm running out of funds, and no matter what, you're going to expect that salary, even though I have no money.
you have no water to give them.
Exactly, yes.
And so what happens then?
No, so I think we have to, in the U.S., I think we have to tune our legislation and our water legislation, and particularly in the Western states, towards the fact that, the climate is changing, population has changed in the distribution, the economies have changed. And speaking of California again, we cannot be subsidizing farmers to grow almonds that are exported to other parts of the world and think that the natural aquifers and water systems in California are going to pick up the bill. And that has to change. And that is happening in many parts of the country, but it is particularly severe in the Western states.
Outstanding. So I would like to now open it up to our student audience for questions on this topic. And so if any of you have some questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Okay, so thank you for the conversation. That was great to listen to. I was just wondering, I know that, or that I assume that when other people think water crisis, they think water crisis and humans. Water crisis in Flint, Michigan, water crisis and droughts in California. But I was curious about how does this water crisis affect the natural world, like animals in the wild and vegetation and ecosystems that are removed from like the civilized human world?
Absolutely. Water is an integral part of most ecosystems around the world, right? So the moment that our human activities, we're growing food, we're producing energy, we're distributing water, we are interrupting a natural process that's referred to as the hydrologic cycle, right? So the moment we do that, we disturb these ecosystems in a big way. And we've seen wetlands drying up. We've seen ecosystems that used to be flush with vegetation being deforested to grow our food and produce agriculture and making them go away forever. So the water crisis is not just about water, it's about everything. Water touches everything. It touches the very systems in which we live. So that is very critical. Thanks for asking that question.
Okay, so my question is kind of focused around dealing with water as a scarcity. You briefly touched on this in terms of infrastructure and architectural support, but since so many humans are dealing with relative deprivation of water, what are some tangible ways that cities or urban areas can use this sustainable type of architecture to preserve water collection?
That's a wonderful question. The biggest thing that we do where we don't get water right is that we extract water from a source, a river, a well, we use it, we throw it away. We want to get more water, use it, throw it away. The places that have been pioneering something that's called water reuse, which is basically you take the water, you use it, you clean it, you use it again, you clean it, you use it again, allows you to, first of all, you already have the water there. You don't have to go to a source to get it, right? So you treat it, you use it, and then you preserve the water sources for when you really need them, right? That has been the case in many water-scarce countries. I had referred earlier to Middle Eastern countries are doing a lot of water reuse. South Africa is perhaps one of the countries where this has been pioneered, and even they ran out of water, very recently with the infamous Day Zero. So this is going to be a continuous challenge, but I think water reuse needs to be a big part of how we approach it.
Thank you guys so much for taking the time to speak to us. My question really talks about or is pertaining to coastal flooding and how much of that has to do with climate change and deforestation. I know there's a little bit of talk about certain cities, such as like Norfolk, Virginia, going underwater in a couple of years or a few years in time. But I was just wondering how much of that is due to climate change or other factors such as deforestation.
Yeah, well, it is great to have brilliant students that ask these fantastic questions. Your question is really at the heart of trying to understand the interaction between climate and water, right? Globally around, and that's certainly the same thing in the United States. About 60% of population globally and in the United States live within 60 miles of a coastline. That's where we have built the majority of our infrastructure. That's where everybody lives. And what we've seen historically for the past over 100 years is that sea level rise have been rising. I grew up in Miami, and in Miami they have something that's called sunny day flooding. That means it floods when there is no rain. It's just the water coming up and flooding significant property. This is starting to happen all over the world. We know it is a combination of temperature increase because of global warming. So a little bit of physics. The temperature increases, water expands. So seawater expands, and because seawater is a lot of water, it will really start rising up and flooding. The other piece that contributes to this is that, you mentioned, is deforestation. So when we take out trees and we clear out land, the water moves through the land much quicker. So rivers that naturally drain into coastal areas do so in much faster. So you have more fresh water coming in, sea level going up. The result is that we have a significant increase in coastal flooding around the world. Certainly here in this country.
Thank you again for the conversation. And my question is, because of climate change and global warming, we have seen there's certain areas scarcity of water, and then other areas there's like flooding due to ice melting, and then other areas it's just drying out. So as we continue throughout the years, we see that each year the temperature is increasing, so there's more global warming happening. How will that affect the water scarcity from one area to the other? And how do you think the world can prepare for those issues? And do you think we will be well prepared for them?
Yes, that's a loaded question. I'll try to give you some brushes of things that we could do to improve things. So certainly with a warming planet, what ends up happening is that the floods become more intense and the droughts become more intense. So you sort of have water being pulled in both ends. So that means we need to be prepared for situations in which these things that we've been describing, floods, droughts, will become, more intense and more frequent, right? So now the way to fix this is, first of all, we need to combat climate change. We need to try to slow down the rate of warming that's already occurring. I think that's one big area of activity. But I think in the medium term, particularly in the short term, we need to become a little bit more conscious of this fact and try to come up with ways to store water. Imagine that I were to tell you that, and think about it, I'll go back to my analogy between water and money, right? Some days you're going to get a lot of money thrown at you, and some days you're not going to have enough money to pay for your basic necessities. So how do you manage that? You do something that's called saving, right? You store water in a place where you can put it when you have too much of it, and you can pull from it when you don't. There's ways of doing this. One is reservoirs. Build lakes and in places in many places around the world that's happening. But I'm going to go back to this issue of working with nature, because I think nature is the solution to these issues, right? I think we have vast amounts of land. Even though we occupy vast amounts of land, we still have much land available to store water, not only in reservoirs, but also in the ground, and also in channels. And reusing water is also part of that solution. So a composite of all these things working together will get us there.
So I think the global freshwater distribution doesn't match the population distribution. And although the United States has many problems of their own, do you think they should be held more responsible towards helping these issues around the world?
Well, you point out to a great item, and I think the issue is that for historical reasons, a lot of the population has established itself in places where probably it shouldn't be. I mean, we have globally, this happens not only in the United States, it happens all over the world. A lot of people, for example, live in what's called floodplains. Floodplains are literally the path of water when there are big storms, and yet people reside there. What's going to happen is that when there's a big storm, people are going to be wiped away. It happens once, and people get reestablished there. It happens again, and people keep doing it. So I think that issue is fixed with proper zoning laws and proper enforcement of such laws. Trying to work with communities to make them more resilient to these big storms. On whether the role of the United States globally, I think perhaps the biggest role that the U.S. can play is through our expertise, through our knowledge, through our research, through our science, in places like Mason, where we carry out research in these areas and where we can export, we can take our knowledge and our experience and share it worldwide. I think that's one of the probably the more useful ways for us to go about it, and it's certainly one of the more exciting ones.
Thank you, Dr. Fernando Morales Wilhelm, for your participation today. And I want to thank all of you for your participation in this episode of Our Future Transformed.